This will most likely be the most important video you watch on shadow work. Why? Because when I was beginning shadow work, the one thing that took me the farthest in my ability to integrate my shadow was this one concept. I call it apex psychology. I wrote a blog post on it. You can check it out at lucidliving.site. But the premise of it is this: the shadow exists in two poles. It could either be a positive or a negative. What does that mean? It could either be acting in a more aggressive energy, or it could be acting in a more introverted energy, a little more withdrawn. And this concept, you're going to be using it all around in various spiritual knowledge. So, for example, if you get into integral psychology, or if you get into the gene keys, if you get into alchemy, this concept of the triangle is going to be used very often. So this should be one of your first steps when beginning your spiritual journey, understanding the bipolar nature of the shadow dynamics. So there is a dynamic here that is going on often between the positive and the negative. And when it becomes an extreme, we can see this being developed in personality disorders. For example, bipolar disorder, where there's literally two poles being shifted in between the manic and the depressed. So let's get into some examples. For example, when we're talking about relationship psychology, I think one of the more popularized concepts is that of the anxious attachment style and the avoidant attachment style. The anxious attachment style comes from the interplay of the positive shadow, or the positive aspect of the shadow, and the avoidant comes from the negative aspect of the shadow. In truth, the secure attachment style is a higher level above these two. You'll see that sometimes there's even people who switch between the anxious and the avoidant attachment style. If you aren't familiar, if you have an anxious attachment style, you'll often find yourself pursuing people. You're the one that chases people. You're the one that's constantly looking for the external validation. And if you're the avoidant personality type, you could probably, or the avoidant attachment style, you could probably be more seen as the asshole, where you find it hard to be in relationships, you find it hard to be intimate, you find it hard to be vulnerable, so you choose to withdraw. And so there's an interesting dynamic that happens in relationship psychology, where the anxious attachment style loves the avoidant attachment style, because the avoidant attachment style is a perfect match to this, in the sense of like trauma bonding, because the anxious attachment style pursues the avoidant, and the avoidant gets the energy from the anxious, because if two avoidants got together, they'd really cancel each other out. They wouldn't connect. So you need this relationship, or this play of the chase and the runner. And oftentimes in a lot of relationships, we see this play out. And this is just one example. And when I saw this, I clearly saw the shadow dynamics being played out. If these two people in a relationship could integrate their shadow, they'd realize that they're really playing the same game. They need each other. And that what one person has is what that person needs. For example, the anxious person needs to learn to be a little more withdrawn, to create their own boundaries, to know when to walk away, to know to respect themselves, basically. And the avoidant personality type, or the avoidant attachment type, needs to learn to give more love, needs to learn to be more vulnerable, to extend a hand to connect. So that's the basic dynamic between the shadow. Because the shadow, let's talk about how it's created. The shadow first gets created as a byproduct of repression. Anytime we repress an aspect of ourselves, we create the shadow. We add on to the shadow. So, for example, maybe you had a little experience where you said your truth, you spoke honestly, but people got offended, and your parents said that that was rude. So maybe you struggle with speaking your truth now, growing up, and that becomes a part of your shadow. Your shadow says, "Don't speak the truth," or like your shadow is basically the individual who wants to speak the truth but cannot speak the truth. So like there's a struggle here that happens, and we can see it play out where maybe you become the person who speaks the truth but doesn't really have any kindness to them. So like that's the aggressive type. The negative type would be the person who doesn't speak out at all and just keeps to themselves. So there's another example. The shadow here is speaking the truth. Whenever we repress that, we develop or whenever we don't develop a good relationship, when we don't integrate that aspect into ourselves, then that leads to getting to a place where we are either too rude or we explode and we just don't even care for what people think. We just speak the truth. For example, it's the guy that calls the person fat, even though they could have just said it another way. Or you could be the guy that doesn't say their truth and just, you know, just doesn't, just lives a life very disingenuous to themselves. So these are various examples, right? Hopefully you're getting the idea that after the shadow, after repression, repression happens as a cutting off of an aspect of oneself. So instead of you being this whole individual, there's a piece of you that gets cut off, and so then you end up living like this. That aspect of yourself that got cut off is a shadow. And the more that you cut off about yourself, the bigger your shadow gets, until eventually your shadow is really the thing that dominates, and then the real you is just this really small aspect. When the shadow gets too big, this leads to a lot of pathological disorders. This leads to, I believe, to a lot of psychological disorders that we have. We could talk about this in the future, but I just want you to understand that the shadow is created through cutting out an aspect of yourself. So the goal then becomes what? The goal becomes retrieval. Retrieval of, well, the self, which also means integration of the shadow. This point is the goal. This is our true north. This is where we want all to be. I need to explain this in a way where when we have an aspect of ourselves in the shadow energy, we are operating at a lower frequency. Below here, if we are able to bring this energy up to this point, we are then able to finally access all the energy that we are wasting here in this bipolar dynamic. So the goal here is transmutation. It's integration. Integration through transmutation, and vice versa. What am I saying? So when you're doing shadow work is the ability to integrate your shadow. It's the ability for you to catch the shadow when it's happening and identify it, and then understand it, and then integrate it. That process is very difficult for a lot of people, but this is one of the key components. When you are able to point out a negative aspect of yourself, you have to find the other aspect of it. You have to find the other polar side of it. For example, if you struggle with negative thoughts, let's think about an example. You struggle with negative thoughts, and here's a good one. You texted a girl, she didn't text back, and so then you beat yourself up. You're like, man, I'm not worthy. She doesn't like me. Like, I'm not worth anything. I should just not even try. I'm not gonna be loved. Mm, That is a negative aspect of the shadow. It's the shadow beating you up, or it's a very internal um, beating up of oneself. But if you can catch the fact that you're doing this, you're gonna look at it and you say, okay, this is actually a more negative aspect. The negative aspect is always more interior. It's more about the self. It's a lot more of a negative energy. So being withdrawn and basically repressing. It's a very repressive energy. When you find that repressive energy, you're gonna look at it, acknowledge it, and you're gonna ask, what is the opposite end of that? So you look at the positive. What is the positive? Is the reactive. So we have the reactive, and then we have the repressive. The reactive side of this, the positive side of this, is the individual who feels entitled to a response. I texted the girl, she needs to text me back. She owes me. I deserve her to text me back. Who does she think she is that she can't text me back? Is she too important for me? Now you might feel like these two energies are very different. The energy of, oh, I'm not good enough, versus she thinks she's too good. They're basically the same thing. If you're able to understand that when you're being this guy right here who's beating himself up, who doesn't feel like he's good enough, and you recognize that you're also being the dude that thinks, you're basically also thinking that you're entitled to a response. You're entitled to a response, and because you don't have that response, you feel like shit. I feel like I want the person to look at themselves, because if they can do this, every time the shadow comes up, there's a negative thought, you always look for the opposite end of that. We as individuals often have a tendency to gravitate towards one of these sides. We either are more reactive, these are the people who are more stressed out, much more loud, much more nervous energy, moving around a lot, very nervous. Or you tend to go towards a more repressive side. Maybe you're the more quiet person, maybe you're more shy, maybe you're um, more mentally stimulated. You live more in your head than you do in your body. But these two expressions are really expressions of a distortion that is going on. They are really two expressions of the misalignment or the cutting off of an aspect of oneself. So the only way to integrate the shadow is to capture it completely. Because when you only find the repressed side of it, you can't find the other side of it. Because this guy is peeking over. He's hiding behind this guy. They're always working together, and they're never too far away from each other. And excuse me. And so your ability to integrate requires first for you to identify the specific nature of the shadow. The next thing requires that you find the opposite end of it. How does it look like? How is it thinking? How do they relate? And once you have that, then you can reconcile them and look at the hypocrisy that is going on, at the lying of oneself that is going on. So in this example of, oh, she thinks she's too good, etc., you can then find a shadow and say, oh, my shadow exists because I believe that I need this person to respond to feel validated. That's what the shadow is basically saying. That you are entitled to a response, and if you don't get it, then there's something wrong with you. this aspect of oneself is always self-centered. It's always going to be, excuse me, it's always going to be more self-centered. And the only way to exit out of this is to elevate the frequency and figure out a way to integrate them both. So there's a person with the low self-worth, and then there's a person with the basically overinflated ego. How can we bring these two together? Well, the way to do it is you take lessons from the other side. You probably are very well used to being the repressive person in this situation. So how about we start learning a little bit more about the reactive side? What does the reactive side have to give or show me in this situation? Well, maybe I can be more assertive. If this person thinks she's too good, well, why can't I feel like I can go talk to her and and be more direct? This is what this is gonna do. It's gonna give you that. It's gonna give you that ability to be more direct, to go after the things that you want. Sometimes you need a ego boost. You need that overinflated ego to create action, to create change. And once you start taking some notes from this guy, with the integration of this guy, that's where wisdom gets built up. And you start realizing that, what's the higher version of this guy, of the reactive nature? Well, the higher version isn't so much aggressive, but the higher nature is assertive. What is the difference? Well, the difference lies in that the assertive person knows what they want, but they understand that there are other human beings that they need to deal with. So it requires intelligence. It requires emotional intelligence. So you realize that what's the difference between this guy and that guy right here? Because there's up here at the top is these two guys still exist, but they exist in higher versions, and their union basically leads to that. So then when you start asking, okay, what's the higher version of this guy and what's the higher version of that guy? You'll see that the higher version of these two guys requires that they come together. And so you'll start to really see that dynamic. This is really the key to integrating the shadow. It's understanding the bipolar dynamic, understanding that they are really one and the same, and understanding that each one can teach something to the other. So if you are more focused on this guy, you can always learn something from that guy, and vice versa. And when you start learning more about that guy, these two dynamics, you become much more intelligent, and you'll see that you have access to all these energies, but there's a way to do it better. You'll see that as you come up, you're gonna be battling with the contradictions. Okay, so I'm a nice guy, but I'm also struggling. But I also want to be more assertive and take action. I don't want to be waiting for years to tell this girl that I love her. So then you might take on aspects of the asshole, and you'll say, you know what? I'm just gonna tell her what's up. I'm just gonna do what I want to do. I'm gonna go after other girls. I'm gonna pursue other girls. Cool. You start doing it, and because you're more used to being this guy, there's gonna be a contradiction that happens, where you're gonna start integrating it, and then you, through experience, will see, oh, now I get why the asshole works. But also, now that I'm here on the asshole spectrum of things, I also get why the nice guy works. They both have their appeal. So how can I make it so that I get the best of both worlds? And that's where you finally reach here. Once you start asking that question, how can I get the best of both worlds? And is there a model out there in the universe that is the best of both worlds? And there is. There always is. That's why spirituality exists, and that's why psychology exists. That's why these things work. So the nice guy versus the asshole, this is another example. But like, what would be the best of those both worlds? It would be the assertive individual, or it would be the superior man, or the masculine man. There's a lot of ideals where, like Adonis, as Hamza has said. Another example, the anxious and the avoidant personality type. What's the best of both worlds? The secure personality type. Another example, let's talk about speaking the truth. So you can say it all rude, at least you're saying it, or you can keep quiet and not hurt people's feelings. How can you get the best of both worlds? It's through emotional intelligence. So you learn, you develop the compassion that comes from this side of things, but you also develop the assertiveness that comes from this side of things, and then you integrate those together to create somebody of emotional intelligence. And so this is the beauty of things. This is where all of spiritual transformation stems from. It's from learning to learning the lesson of shadow for me has it's been great. The lesson of shadow has showed me that wherever you are in the negative, like whenever you're struggling, specifically with the shadow, you are either in one of these poles. You're switching back and forth, back and forth. The only way out of your problem, I feel like all problems exist in this area, in this bipolar dynamic. All problems exist here. Problems do not exist once you reach this higher state. So, if you find yourself struggling with something specific, what is the other end of that? And then, what can you learn from that end? And then, can you integrate them both and get the best of both worlds? This is going to help you solve so many problems, so many issues. I'm even thinking about it right now, like content, for example. So like I've been struggling with creating content. I want to create a lot of content, but I want to create great quality content. And so like I've been struggling I've been more on the negative side that's been, I don't want to post content because I want to make sure that's perfect. But on the opposite end of the pole, there's the reactive side, which says just post it and go, just post, post, post. And I've been kind of moving towards this, but I've realized that this is also important. So what's the best way out of it? It's an integration of both, where I'm posting, where I'm posting more, but I'm also making sure that I'm growing little by little. That is the key, and that's where this lies. Creativity, output, etc. So hopefully this is helpful. Those are the shadow dynamics, the bipolar nature of the shadow, and how to basically integrate the shadow through getting the best of both worlds. Thank you for tuning in. I hope that was helpful. I'll see you in the next one. You already know, stay lucid. Peace out.